Good afternoon. I hope everyone is doing well and taking good care out there. Welcome to today's program. I am Dr. Lisa Coleman. I am the Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation in the Office of Global Inclusion, which we refer to as OGI. Um, Let me just first note that if you look at the bottom of your screens, you should be able to use your closed captioning. So literally right there at the bottom, it says CC. You can click on that if you need closed captioning. I'll wait for everyone to find that button and make sure that you have access. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's event reflecting on our understanding of autism, which Michael John Carley, in recognition of the American Disabilities Act 30th anniversary, which was officially on July 26th, and he has joined us today to have a discussion. First, I'd like to just begin again by saying I hope that everyone's taking really good care out there. We have know that during this pandemic, what we are seeing is that people are being affected in all kinds of ways. Um, and so we hope that you're taking really good care of yourselves, your families, your colleagues, and your loved ones. I'd also like to take this time to just say thank you to all of the people who make this work possible, including an incredible team behind the scenes that is working right now to make this happen. So I'd also like to thank all those people who work behind the scenes every day, all the people who are working during this pandemic, including our healthcare workers, etc., but also the people who work to just make things keep things running. The people who clean the hospitals, the delivery workers, all of the people who contribute to our ability to just be. Thank you. Again, thank you to my team. I think one of the best things that one can do as a leader is to hire incredibly smart, incredibly talented people, and to have them join you as part of a team. And so we have been able to do that in the Office of Global Inclusion, and I'm extremely pleased to have Michael John Carley join that team recently. And I will introduce him in a moment. Right now, I'd also like to take 10 seconds, excuse me, of silence to recognize the ancestors and people who've paved the way for us to be here, as well as to recognize the land upon which we stand and occupy. Thank you for that recognition. This event today is part of our ongoing NYU Be Together initiative. The Be Together initiative is a new and innovative change-making effort that was announced by our own President Hamilton and the New York NYU Board of Trustees. It is an initiative focused on making global change across all of NYU's campuses and our global network by innovating change, working together, and thinking about action and transformation. It builds on our 2015 being at NYU assessment, which where we had the opportunity to come together and voice and reflect on who we are as a dynamic and globally interconnected community. As we know, COVID-19 has exacerbated inequities. Exacerbated all kinds of inequities. We have seen racism, xenophobia. We have seen all kinds of issues with members of our LGBTQ plus communities. We, even prior to, of course, obviously we've seen issues of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So as we all think about all of the issues and we think about the breadth and depth of our community, um, this is an opportunity for us to all come together and to engage with one another and to build and leverage the diversity that we have across our constituency groups. And obviously, the increased pressures as COVID-19 has impacted members of communities of persons with disabilities. And so today we'll be able to talk a little bit about autism. And we know that in terms of neurodiverse communities, being on Zoom, et cetera, is not exactly great all day. So really thinking about the ways we engage with our communities is really important during this time. Virtual learning, as we know, is crucial, but we also have to think about the ways in which we're engaging all members of our community. So it's up to us now to make changes, to transform what we do, and how do we take action. And NYU Be Together is just one of those efforts to think about change. It's an honor to have this program today and to be able to celebrate and honor ADA's 30th anniversary. We will have some additional programs during the course of the year. We are hosting this program with the goal of raising our awareness for action. And we hope it will also serve as an opportunity to reflect on the progress that we've made around disability rights, inclusion, and inclusive culture, thanks to numerous disability inclusion advocates and movements across many, many decades. I don't know where we would be without our advocates and activists in this area. So thank you to everyone, both at NYU and externally, who's been working on these very important issues. I know in my own work, this has been very important to me, dating back to several decades ago in my own work with several different institutions. And so we know there's much work that we still need to do. And so we hope that as we continue these efforts, we will work together to address all of the salient and relevant issues. At NYU, the disability inclusive culture has been a focus for us. And it's been aligned to, as I said, to the assessment that we took in 2017 related to the 2015 listening sessions. As I've already noted, there have been differential impacts around, and particularly for persons with disability. And when we think about the intersectional issues pulling on the work of people like Kimberly Crenshaw, we know that people with disabilities and then people with disabilities who are members of other populations are experiencing, of course, challenges during this time. Topics that will certainly emerge and that we must focus on here at NYU, recognizing the vibrant nature of all of our people with all abilities, strengths, and needs. And so we continue these discussions and this programming to think about ongoing institutional, interpersonal, and individual ableism and oppression, evolving our understanding and framing and reframing of diversity of abilities and strengths, thinking about visible and non-apparent disabilities and neurodiversity, as I already mentioned, and really reframing how we do this work and how we engage communities, challenging a deficit model toward one that is asset-based, right? And this is really crucial. Lots of people have heard me talk about this, but how we frame issues is what we get. If we frame something as a problem, then we get a problem. If we frame something as an asset, that's what we get as an asset. And what I say is when I'm looking at members of disability communities, people of color, looking at myself, I don't see a problem. I see an asset. I see solutions. I see opportunity. And that's what we're trying to do here at NYU, is to build on that. I've already mentioned this in terms of intersectionality and multiple identities, but obviously across our NYU community, we have lots of people with lots of different identities, multiple identities simultaneously. And how do we center those marginalized communities and identities and action steps in all that we do across our community here at NYU? As we engage in our work to build a more inclusive culture, I want to stress again that we have to have this asset-based approach, understandings that our solutions will come from diverse, inclusive, and equitable areas right across our organization. Finally, let me say, as we get started on today's program, I want to specifically thank some of our partners and colleagues from across NYU. I say this all the time. I'm a relatively new person within the NYU community. There was a great deal of work happening prior to my arrival, and there is a great deal of work happening in partnership with so many. So first of all, let me thank the Provostio Office's Disability, Inclusion, and Accessibility Working Group, and all of the members of that working group. You all have been doing tremendous work for a long time, even before the group was formed, right? Independent and as independent actors and as scholars. Thank you in particular to Karen Narcissian, Faye Ginsburg, and Mara Mills for all of your work and your co-chairing that particular committee. Thank you to the Moses Center for Student Accessibility. And Robin, I can't thank you enough for the partnership, the ongoing work, Robin Weiss, who of course is the director of that center, the ongoing work and partnership in the student area, faculty and staff. So thank you to those two organizations, two groups within NYU. The NYU Center for Disability Studies, again, thinking about the scholarship and the work. So thank you to our disability scholars and all of the people who are advancing the work in those areas. Thank you to our Office of Equal Opportunity, and in particular, Kelly Collier-Brown for their work around employee accommodations and related training and support and capacity building. Again, sometimes we overlook these the important work of compliance in these areas, but again, without your partnership, we would not be able to do the important work across all of NYU, including trainings, etc. Disability accessibility teams, thank you for all of your work. We very much appreciate your teamwork. To Dr. Karen Jackson-Weaver, to Leah Lattimore, to Dr. Chandani Patel, and my entire team who've done so much work around disability inclusive culture, including the pedagogical seminars for faculty, our digital inclusion toolkit 1.0 for faculty, and our disability zone, which is our education program centered on students. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Working closely with our partners, we continue to do a lot of programmatic work, so please join us for all of our programs. We try to make sure that they are also accessible. We'll be having another discussion tomorrow with an author, Matthew Fry Jacobson, at noon, so we hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Michael John Carley, our new disability inclusive culture consultant within my office, who's come to support our disability inclusive culture hub within OGI. Dr. Jackson Weaver serves as Michael John's day-to-day supervisor, but we have the pleasure of working with him. I'll just say a couple of things about him. He's the founder and executive director of GRASP. He has served as the executive director of ASTEP. He has been on the board of directors for Autism, the advisory board of Gallup NYC. He's trained and facilitated numerous across numerous companies and Fortune 500, Fortune 5,000, 1,000 companies, and he is also an author and has published widely. But I think the most important thing that I can say about Michael John is that he is a tremendous leader. He has come to NYU. We are already seeing the enthusiasm in our community, particularly across our student community, which of course is so important to us. And the other thing is, he's just a pleasure to work with. He has really been an asset to our team and helping us think about so many things across the disability area, and particularly these important areas of neurodiversity. So thank you, Michael John, for being with us. Thank you for accepting our invitation to join the team. And thank you for doing this today to honor and celebrate the 88th, 30th anniversary. We appreciate you. I turn it over to you now.
Lisa, thank you, thank you, thank you. I want to back up your thanks to all of my brand new OGI colleagues, because everybody should know that this event here today is the product of at least a dozen of these brilliant and, more importantly, wonderful new colleagues that I get to work with under Lisa, your direction. And so I thank them tremendously for that. I also want to thank the entire NYU system, actually, for the creation of this position, whether it's me or somebody else involved in it, because this is a disability inclusive culture position whose words really don't resonate amongst any of the positions on any of the universities, arguably in the planet. This is a very revolutionary, very innovative idea that comes from not only Lisa and this wonderful OGI team, but a very progressive administration. And also, never to be forgotten, it also stems from a brilliant and passionate disability advocacy community amongst the students of New York University. And so I thank them tremendously. Before we get to the reflecting on our understanding of autism here today, I just want to give just a couple of quick notes on ADA to help us, because Lisa did such a wonderful job in framing the autism discussion amongst the greater diversity and inclusive universe. And ADA is what we're here to celebrate. Maybe just a couple of notes. Number one is, we have to understand that there's this inherent promise with all new legislation. And 30 years ago was a very long time ago. And what we're seeing already with attempts, or maybe even some small successes, to overturn legislation that was created just by the previous administration during President Obama's time shows us that all of these legislations are inordinately vulnerable to coercive efforts. And so we have to be on our guard. Just a couple of years ago, there was a Republican effort that passed the House, but not the Senate, thankfully, which was legislation that would prevent so-called frivolous lawsuits against businesses by removing a lot of the incentives to comply with the accessibility laws based on ADA. Once again, also, ADA was based on words like better access, stronger access. ADA was really not talked about in the context of guaranteed access. And when it comes to the subject of enforcement, I think we all know where that lies. And Lisa, thank you for framing this in the context of all marginalized populations, because all marginalized populations have had their histories of eugenics. And for those who don't know really what that means, it's a lot of really horrific things in all of our collective histories where there's a perceived disposability amongst communities like ours. And just a couple of years ago, the California penal system was cutting deals with female inmates. We'll give you early release if you tie your tubes. That's genetics. That's eugenics, excuse me, eugenics. Also, there's the whole notion of the need for context, okay? We change in the course of 30 years. Sometimes the words don't change, but we change as a people, and so our relationships to the words change. And in 2007, we underwent what I thought was a good contextual change, where we realized that maybe giving ADA protection to certain diagnoses wasn't the right way to go. And maybe instead, we should offer it to all diagnoses, but instead based on their level of challenges within those diagnoses. And I think that that was a good use of context. If you want an example of a bad use of context, look no further than how we misperceive the Second Amendment as someone's right to own 90 machine guns, okay? That amendment was put in there for a musket that fired one shot that went 25 yards, and it took you 60 seconds to reload the weapon. So, and just to also, conclude also on Lisa's, most important note, that we are talking about human beings here that can be turned into incredible assets, not just assets. And that unfortunately, especially in the autism field, we've been looked upon as problems. We are somewhat intimidating in this context that when we define disability, we are talking about a whole nother universe that maybe on another day we would have more time to share and talk about how complex and also how consequently intimidating all this stuff can be to people, which prevents them from learning. So we all have to also learn how to become better teachers. This is the last thing I'll say about ADA. And this is a very famous picture that many of you probably already know. This is a picture of 8-year-old Jennifer Keenan, who in 1990, as everybody was pushing for the ADA to be passed, she abandoned her wheelchair and she, with her hands, crawled up all 82 steps of the Capitol. And I'd like to also mention it was a hot day. This is not Jennifer's words necessarily, but every time I look at this picture and I look at Jennifer and what she might be saying to me, I don't see her saying, look at me. I see her saying, follow me. And I think that speaks to all of us, so especially if we want progress. I'm going to start this off with a personal story, but just one. 20 years ago, I had a non-traditional but satisfying life. I was a struggling playwright by night and a minor league diplomat operating out of the UN by day. I had kind of a cooler, quote unquote, stupid day job. And in essence, I was doing work in such romantics hotspots like Bosnia and Cuba and Iraq before the invasion. And literally in late 2000 was when I and my then 4-year-old son were diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome just 1 week apart late in the year. And I would invite you to try and imagine something that might be hard to fathom, that the words, not just autism, but also Asperger's syndrome were thought of as mud back then. You were destined to a second-class life, supposedly, if these words were a part of your life. And I remember thinking, of course, I've got a family, I've got a career, maybe this isn't right. But the point of the story was a couple of days after the diagnosis, I was in an elevator with a colleague. And I was sharing with my colleague my son's diagnosis, but not mine. I wasn't going to go there. And she said at one point, she fooled me. She knew more about this stuff than I thought she did. She said, well, isn't that genetic? And I got caught. I was like, well, I don't know. I'm not really sure. No, that can't be, no. The elevator hits the bottom floor and my colleague walks out, and I'll never forget the image of her back as I watched her walk. Because at that particular moment, I knew that I had stabbed my own son in the back. What garbage would it be for me to ever say to him, you should be proud of who you are, if I was going to be such a coward? So life changed. Let's begin. Here's what we're going to talk about today. Number one, the situation on the ground. If you ask any journalist, how do you construct a story? The first thing they're going to tell you about is you talk about the situation on the ground. Who's fighting who, who's shooting at who, where is it happening, who are the players? And then the next part of the story, obviously, is going to be what's the history? And we're going to go through a very brief history of autism, some of the myths surrounding it, but these are taken in the context that these were all happening to the most economically privileged nation on earth. And our history here is sometimes infinitely more draconian and Kafkaesque than we remember. And it's important to learn this because it explains so much of the dysfunctional attitudes that we've had about autism, Asperger's, and pretty much all behavioral differences in general. And then we're just going to go through some simple charts. I'm going to show you a concept of how we can look at a behavioral difference that surprises us, if not anything unknown that sort of enters our hemisphere. And then we'll close with a little bit of perspective, and then we will have a question and answer period. So the situation on the ground really starts with the complexity of the spectrum. There is maybe no other condition on earth in which you might have such a disparity inherent within this spectrum. If, for instance, on one end of the spectrum, you have somebody who may never acquire speech, may never work a steady job for very long, may never have an intimate relationship, but at the same point has the chance for an infinitely happy life. And yet on the other end of the spectrum, you have all these famous people being diagnosed in retrospect: Albert Einstein, Emily Dickinson, Ludwig van Beethoven, Thomas Edison. That's a big spectrum. And that's really hard to get that mental picture that, let's say, you might get when you imagine, what comes into your head after hearing the words Down syndrome or cystic fibrosis. And when we're trying to sell the messages of what this population needs and desires and deserves to the average Joe or Jane in the street, this is hard because humans like to compartmentalize. And this diagnosis is a very hard one to compartmentalize. And then we have the DSM-5, which occurred about 7 years ago in 2013. And the situation on the ground here was that we had a situation where prior to DSM-5, we had our disagreements, but we had a clinical community that we could trust. DSM-4 had really sort of changed the world in a lot of ways. And when DSM-5 came around, unfortunately, the clinicians in charge of this new book, or this new lexicon for defining who we are, they fought amongst each other. One person left the committee in a huff. The other ones were infinitely less gracious than the one who left the committee. And it was all aired out publicly to the point where I think we have an inherent distrust now in the clinical community. And I like the diagnostic freedom that sometimes comes across with this, but at the same point, diagnostic anarchy every once in a while, we kind of need a clinical community, I think, that we can trust. And I think that because of this book, we don't have that. A plethora of butcherous clinicians. What does Carley mean by that? He means that with all of the attention that's been given to the autism spectrum, most especially because of the prevalence numbers, not just because we fight all the time, that this is really its own economic market. And if you're somebody who's in need of a new therapist and you white page call, actually, no, they don't do that anymore. You cold call somehow a therapist and you say, do you know your Asperger's, your autism? And they might say, sure, because they read the one-page description in the DSM. That's a recipe sometimes for irreparable damage, because just as we are sometimes needed to be taught differently in an educational context, so too do we need to be treated differently in a therapeutic context. So really get your specialists, go to your local autism societies and ask for references. Don't cold call. 1 in 54, that's the new prevalence number that we hear now. It's a number that continues to grow every time prevalence numbers are examined. And it's probably going to continue to grow, especially when you consider some of the big picture factors like how many people are locked away, incarcerated, that could have been helped by this knowledge 70 years ago or even 40 years ago? How many people, same thing, having to do with folks that have been locked up in institutions and misprescribed the wrong pharmaceuticals for basically their entire lives? And more of an increased attention on adults. And let's also understand that the prevalence numbers could continue to rise, because the more that we work on being inclusive means that a lot of people like us are going to get jobs, and with the money that we get from jobs, we're going to take people out on dates maybe, and long story short, we're maybe going to procreate more. I don't want to give you a we're taking over the world kind of a situation here, but to say that anybody should expect there to be a fixed prevalence number that's going to last forever into eternity is just not possible. And hopefully will continue until the DSM-20, in which all this stuff will just be thought of as natural extensions of the human experience. We have problems in the autism world. We fight. Holy cow, do we fight, okay? And in the next slide, I would like you to take 2 seconds and identify for yourselves the first 3 words that come to your mind. This is indeed a picture of a nonverbal person on the spectrum. The person's name is Mel Baggs. Mel is a trans man who here was one of the heroes of the autism world, and we lost Mel this past year. And Mel took this photo of Mel so that here could respond to a particularly demonizing campaign that a certain autism organization had put out saying, this is the face of autism, and that had sort of a similar picture. But Mel, who communicates through a typing device and blogged through a blog called Ballast Existens, wrote brilliantly. And this is what Mel had to say about this picture of Mel. This is what I look like when I'm trying to relax or zone out a little, or shut off vision so that I can hear what is going on around me. I have no doubt that someone could use this image to show the tragedy and despair inherent in autism. Black and white images that, such as these and the captions that go along with them, are designed to create a reaction. Most often, disability organizations run by non-disabled people use them to elicit pity and money at the expense of the truth. Look at the autistic person in her own world, they say. Isn't it tragic? What I am doing in this photograph is no different than someone curling up with a good book to unwind after a long day. Some autistic people would even say that it's bad to publish pictures that look like this. Better to publish the ones that make us look like real people. Those are the better pictures. I say that plays straight into the hands of people who think there's something wrong with the way we look. And this is a list of a lot of the famous folks that have been diagnosed as on the spectrum. If this list is hard to read, that's part of the point. It's also a list that I might add does not show, like that prevalence number of 1 in 54, how under-acknowledged economically challenged communities or people of color are. We don't look for this stuff in our history books. We still underdiagnose in economically challenged communities. It's reflective of an inordinate amount of things. And I'll tell you another thing. This is a list taken from only 3 books. There are more books diagnosing more and more supposedly famous people on the spectrum. And this is a little chart that I did a long, long while ago that sort of showed what the world looked like in terms of, you know, the cliques and the players and the playground. And then I kind of had this thing about who likes who. So it was kind of like 4th grade, but this was, you know, this was caused in large part because of, again, those oppositional needs sometimes of the opposite ends of the spectrum. There was one end that might, you know, be so desperate for services and so overwhelmed and not knowing who to blame, whether it's the vaccine people or what have you. Well, I should talk about that in a sec. But in essence, the emotionally unhealthy answers were always encouraged at that time by organizations that would profit from such alarmist rhetoric. And the things we fought about were things like language, like the word cure. Cure was especially the biggest word other than disease and some of the other ones, but cure was the one that was most important to get out, not just because of the ethical notion of people using it to describe us. And, you know, as we know, as a law of ethics, that you don't get to use words on a particular population that they haven't exactly approved of yet. But there was also, believe it or not, this was a word that was being used by the research organizations that did treat our lives as though they did not contain an awful lot of value, and that, you know, something needed to be done to change us. Those particular organizations were medical research organizations. And the interesting thing about this is that if something comes to you via genetics, you can't be cured. You're born with it and you're going to die with it. So it wasn't just an ethical wrong, it was a medical impossibility that was being proposed anyway. The vaccine debate, another camp of the folks that wanted to paint autism as your life is pretty much over, or that parents were just burdened all the time by folks like us. The vaccine debate, unfortunately, however, continues to plague us. Report after report after report has said that this, while the environment can provide exacerbators, that this is a primarily genetic condition. Mom or dad might have been a carrier position, but you got it from mom or dad. Aversives. For those who don't know what that word means, it's basically what can an institution do to, let's say, that individual that they feel is having a bad day and is about to harm them physically. Unfortunately, the laws that exist within these facilities, and it goes state by state, are not the same laws that apply to you and me who live outside these institutions. We just recently, finally, were able to close a place called the Judge Rottenberg Center in Massachusetts that applied electric shocks pretty much whenever they wanted to their, I'm going to call them inmates, but you know, to their supposed clients. I can't call them clients. And we just finally were able to close that particular center. That's got to be wrong. Research. What kind of research? A lot of times I think a lot of us think, you know, well, autism research, well, it's all got to be good, right? Not really. If you're funding research that is looking into what kind of housing needs exist for people on the spectrum, or, you know, what are the employment statistics looking like? Are we getting better at incorporating people on the spectrum into the workplace? That's the research funding that gets about 2% of the full amount. There's educational research that we've spent maybe another 5 to 8% of the available funding on, but that has a unique conundrum in that I think we've done plenty of research that now sits on a shelf. And it sits on a shelf because we won't spend the money to incorporate it into our schools, which is what's needed more than more educational research. At least 90% of the research funding goes into the medical stuff, the nerve synapses, the serotonin levels, that in the old days was after that, you know, supposed cure for autism. And this isn't necessarily bad. Knowledge is probably going to benefit everybody. But what I find objectionable is that some of these organizations will go to the average working class family with a child with autism and say, you should walk in our walk to raise money for our organization because it will help your child. And unfortunately, this is research that won't help the average working class family with a child of autism for at least 20 years. It's kind of a lie. So that's our situation, a very brief history of autism and of a stigma. And remember, most economically privileged nation on earth, folks. Dr. Leo Kanner identifies autism in 1943. The things he's looking for are an inability to communicate verbally, a preference of objects to people, a disliking of breaks in routine, and high intelligence. Remember that one. And then exactly just 1 year later, Dr. Hans Asperger identifies Asperger syndrome in 1944. But the things he's looking for are an inability to pick up nonverbal communication, passionate interests, motor skills deficits, and an oddly exhibited use of the spoken word. Now, the interesting thing here is that Kanner's work spreads, but Asperger's work does not. Asperger's work wasn't even translated into English until the early 1980s by Lorna Wing. Why? Well, there was this World War, and Asperger's work was being conducted under the auspices of a Nazi occupation, which didn't spell a lot of reputable thinking for a lot of the science, any of the science that was coming out of such atmospheres. And Leo Kanner's work was being done in America, and we had just won a world war, and everybody wanted our science, they wanted our blue jeans, they wanted our music, they wanted our cars. So that part is kind of inevitable, but it's still interesting sometimes to think if we had known about the knowledge of both these people's work at the same time, how far more advanced we would be in our collective knowledge of how broad a spectrum autism is and always was. And then we come to the 1960s and the early 1970s, and we hear this man's name, Bruno Bettelheim, for the first time. For those of you who don't know who Bruno Bettelheim was the rock star clinician of his time. Back then, you didn't have 80,000 licensed clinical professionals competing for the same book deals and podcasts. You had the rock star. And the rock star's every belief was bought hook, line, and sinker by the American public. And Bruno Bettelheim had a theory about autism, that you got your autism because your mother wasn't affectionate enough with you in the nanoseconds after you were born. Brilliant, right? Oh, I used sarcasm, I'm proud. This is the era where the term refrigerator mothers that many of you might have heard about, this is where it comes from. And I'm sure you can imagine all those mothers who were thinking to themselves, that's crazy, that's impossible. I know I was affectionate with my child immediately after they were born. I can't see this. I just don't understand this. But because everybody believes differently, because Bruno Bettelheim says so, and his word is believed more than yours, you eventually acquiesce. So think of all of the women that had certain parts of themselves destroyed by this. And also remember that in these days, you were told with a child with autism, put him in a home and forget you ever had him. Okay. Now, we can also think about the women, but we can also think about the partners of these women. This is my wife's fault. We can also think about the siblings of that autistic child. Don't expect any affection out of mom. You see what she did to our brother? This man destroyed thousands of families. And the iconography of the word changed because of his history was the suggestion of bad mothering, highly encouraged separation. So it's pretty logical then to avoid the diagnosis of autism, wouldn't you say? And then we come to the next period, then the second of two periods, which I'm going to describe for you here in the late 1970s and the 1980s. And oddly enough, we quickly learned about how silly Bettelheim's rules were. We got rid of them instantly. It wasn't like an anti-war movement or suffragette movement, which gradually takes hold. This was overnight. And suddenly you start hearing this phrase, why do you want to put a label on him? Suddenly we're now thinking, you know what? All doctors are bad. All diagnoses are bad. Labels are just restrictive. They're these things that go on your tombstone that rob you of, the chance to become a real individual in life. But they're not. We instead, in this particular period, just went to the opposite extreme of where we've been in the Bettelheim era, because diagnoses and these labels help us to get a start on what we might be challenged at, what we might be, really strong at, so that we save a lot of time in figuring out who we actually are as individuals. That's why they're so helpful. But under these auspices, we just kind of went in the opposite direction. And the iconography of autism under an anti-labelist version would be things like intentionally vague descriptions of all diagnoses as special at the time. Now, this is actually important because we never had a positive word used to describe autism. Special was the first one, Special Olympics, special education. However, the word hasn't changed. This is another one of those prime examples, but we've changed as a people. And we haven't come up with a solution as to what to substitute, but that word now resonates to us as condescending. And we do need to keep trying to come up with a substitute for it. So by keeping the aura surrounding the individual undefined, and by undefined, I mean that nobody's going to use the word autism under the anti-labelist days, because it means that your son could be taken away from you, or they would suggest that you put him in a home and forget you ever had him. And you don't want that to happen, so you don't use the word. And when you don't use the word, the child doesn't hear anything about autism. So no matter what, in both of these communities, you've got damage to the child knowing why they're different from everybody else. And nobody could prescribe anything harmful to the family dynamic. The question is this the avoidance of stigma that I think everybody wanted? Did these two eras really contradict each other as much as the anti-labelists had hoped? And I think the answer is a big no. Both prevented individuals from having a say in their care, denying self-advocacy, if not the concept altogether of self-advocacy, because the individual, again, doesn't know what they know. That doesn't know who they are. They don't have a word for it. And again, we assume the negative. And so we are always going to think of ourselves as second-class citizens as a result. It's the demonization of diagnosis itself, and both of these communities attach negative words. I'm just going to kind of flip through this because the real progress obviously has been made. I highly recommend you look up an article called Don't Mourn for Us that separated what the parent responsibilities are from the actual responsibilities of the individual in figuring out who they are, and that they are indeed different walks. We have the DSM-4, which put Asperger's syndrome into our lexicon in 1994. And in the late 1990s and 2000s, you had an explosion of books by people on the spectrum. We're communicating subtly, and we're not only writing one, here's how awful my life was and now I'll disappear book, we're writing second and third books, and they're actually based in positive experiences. And the new organizations, such as My Grasp and ASAN, which were run by people on the spectrum, Autism Speaks, that we were pretty much fighting with for the entire time there, and the impressive revelation of how important regional parents organizations, not national parents organizations, were, because in essence it was locals leading locals, which will always be the better result. And the big kahuna to take away is that people were after our opinions, not just our experiences. Myths since dispelled: passionless, humorless, no sexual appetite, don't get me started. We're all great at math, we're not. Happiness being the ability to communicate. This was where semantically a lot of our problems lied, because we thought, oh, he can talk, he's happier. No. An individual, let's say on my end of the spectrum, might have an IQ of 5,000, but because nobody explained the social world to them, they can end up miserable. Whereas a nonverbal individual, if they have a happy place to live and something to do in their day, and nobody minds that they look at pretty colors for the rest of the day, they can be very happy. 65 to 85% boys, these are the statistics. When we know all there is to know about girls and women on the spectrum, it's probably going to be closer to 50-50, but we're not there yet. And we need to look a lot more into that category. Just very briefly, I'm going to show you a characteristic and a critical interpretation and an instructional positive interpretation of how you might view a behavioral characteristic of the autism spectrum. Intense absorption in a topic of field of interest. Individual is obsessed and is driven further into this absorption by anxiety and stress. Individual is passionate. Discomfort or inability at small talk, sees no logic in it. Off-putting and impolite, gets to the point. For a lot of people, this is refreshing. Says whatever comes into their head, unaware of the potential damage the statement might cause. Individual is rude. Individual is honest. Our makeup is based on these factors here. And the one we're talking about here is neurological makeup, but I would argue that the most important aspect of this list is quality of supports. Whoever you are, if you're raised to feel good about who you are, you've got a shot. This is my one moment of shameless self-promotion. I got a third book on the way, and I would like you to absorb my favorite quote of all time. It's on my first book. It comes from Helen Keller, blind, hearing challenged, and developmentally disabled herself. Security is a superstition. It does not exist in nature. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. OGI crew, thank you so very much. Audience, it's been a pleasure. I gotta confess, this is my first webinar after like 260 presentations. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much, Michael John Carley. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I know we've already got some questions in the queue, and so I know I'm going to let them get those up and framed for you. But I just wanted to jump back on and say thank you. Thank you again to all of our partners. I've been getting some texts and emails in the background, so I just also want to make a couple of other announcements. We have a new class coming forward for Big Ideas. Some of you know at NYU, we have these Big Ideas courses coming forward. And so I just got an email from another one of our partners. I'm sorry, I'm trying to pull it up really quickly. Is yes, from Christy. Yes, from Christy in our, who works with our NEST program and also does work, Christy Koenig, on neurodiversity. So thank you for your partnership. And we have 2-credit course that will be happening coming out of our Center for Disability Studies. And so we hope that you all will look for that course as well, because we think that'll be another opportunity for people to learn. The questions are there, Michael John, so I'm going to turn it back over to you and let you answer some questions now.
Awesome, Lisa. Thank you so very much for all your help in putting this together and your leadership. It's much appreciated. Okay, I think I see one in a particular area that I know a little bit about. You know, everybody should also note that with all the side issues that you could talk about with this stuff, whether it's employment, whether it's disclosure, whether it's sports, whether it's the arts, whether it's sex, these are subjects that we can talk for 5 hours each on. So there's so much more for people to learn here. I am interested in ways that a workplace can become more inclusive. Do you encourage self-disclosure? How do we engage in more inclusive practices when people do not know that someone is on the spectrum? Disclosure, it's a great question, and it's one that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, I think are struggling with right now. We have to remember that disclosure is a very sort of tricky art or science, and that as individuals on the spectrum, I think it's also important for us to understand that it is based, whether or not to disclose and whether or not we're smart enough to disclose or not, is based on our evaluation of the other people. And sometimes we don't pick up on those signals all that well. So I think it's really important for people like me and everybody else to understand that, or everybody else on the spectrum, that you're gonna make a wrong call every once in a while about who to disclose to, and that's okay. You know, we really do learn so much more through failure than through little successes and becoming success. And that's an important part of, you know, raising, I think, anybody, is getting that thick skin towards failure. But more directly, I would say that at the workplace, disclosure is a little bit different, because whenever we disclose, we're doing so because we want something. We may want understanding. We may want affirmation for the fact that, you know, things have maybe come a little bit harder for us than others. But in the workplace, obviously, it's usually to protect ourselves. We sense maybe something isn't going right on the job with our colleagues, and we're afraid, you know, of getting fired for autism-related characteristics. So the best thing about the best rule about disclosure in the workplace is, number one, do it in writing. Okay, you do it in writing in any situation where you can't be certain that the person that you disclose to is going to be supportive. You know, a lot of times, because we're scared and we're feeling very vulnerable about, you know, revealing this information about who we are, that we kind of expect the other person to take care of us, and that doesn't happen a lot. A lot of times, if they're people we don't know, we have some explaining to do. We maybe have to teach them a little bit about what autism is. But in the workplace, if you do it through writing, then you don't have to see, let's say, your manager, the manager that you sent your disclosure to in writing, you don't have to see his or her messy-headed reaction to your disclosure. You don't have to see, you know, if in the worst case scenario, you're just using this as an excuse, you know, a lot of the language that we had before that, you don't have to watch that. And they will process that instead by themselves in their own office, reading your email, and they can maybe realize, hey, maybe accusing my employee of that isn't such a smart idea or a very good idea. And so they get to work out whatever their funky feelings are about your disclosure. And the other thing, obviously, to do in a workplace disclosure is to CC your supervisor's supervisor, so that we can just make sure that there's accountability all around. But, you know, again, as Lisa said in the very, very beginning of this, we're never going to be able to truly, you know, provide an inclusive environment to Fortune 500 companies or even small businesses until we really learn how to convince these businesses that the more diversified your company is, the more you will outperform your peers. Harvard Business Review, everybody is proving this stuff now day by day. But to give just one iota of sympathy to the companies, it's a confidence issue. It's not an unwillingness issue. And we have to be the ones to train them. We have to be the ones to sell them on how to incorporate and to onboard these brilliant individuals that will make their company so much more outside of the box thinking companies. All right. Let's see. Somebody put, oh my goodness, somebody put up my, DeAndre put up my congressional testimony. A little bit of background, if you look at that, the vaccine belief folks had all gotten there at 4 o'clock in the morning so they could have all the seats behind us, if you view that. In 2012, Congress had their first ever hearings on autism, and I was one of 2 people on the spectrum to testify. It's a 3.5-hour event, but 2.5 hours are dedicated to Congress people yelling at the CDC. So just be prepared. So that if I said something, you know, that stated that, no, this doesn't come from vaccines, you had a bunch of people behind me going, no, no. And that was the strategic use. And there was one congressperson who actually stayed for the entire hearings and listened to everything. Usually the Congress people just go in and out. Man's name was John Lewis. Let's see, I am interested. Okay, besides behavior therapy. What other methods can be used to help control stereotypes? Is it recommended to try to focus attention to control movement in objects? I'm not sure if I'm really understanding the question, but I think it has to do with the relationship between who has to change more. And I think that the rest of society has to change more. Sorry. Actually, that might not be a sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put that implication on your question. You know, this is such a two-way street. And, you know, when Autistic Johnny's walking down the street 20 years ago and everybody calls the cops because he's flapping his arms and making noises and showing his teeth, you know, we have done the grunt work to change greater society to the point where most people now know that, oh, that's just autism. And there's even a few people out there who aren't, you know, associated with autism in any way that might even understand that the noises that person is making are actually an expression of pleasure. Why would we want to kill an expression of pleasure? So a lot of the work, you know, that we've done therein, Brenda Smith-Miles especially would tell you that when it comes to accommodations and how resentful the world can sometimes be when it comes to the subject of accommodations, that she likes everybody to know that however, you know, just put off you are by the fact that you have to provide that accommodation. Understand that the individual on the spectrum has been accommodating you maybe 2,000 times as much as you will ever accommodate that person on the spectrum. Love on the oh, question about Love on the Spectrum on Netflix. What do you think about the Netflix series Love on the Spectrum? I've watched the first 2 episodes and I absolutely love it. Absolutely love it. Absolutely love it. I especially love it because they're the first show to integrate and to acknowledge that the autism spectrum has such a high percentage of LGBTQ people and queer people on the spectrum into the show. And they do it lovingly and everybody's just really charming. I love the show. And a guy I know pretty well is on later on in the season, so I haven't gotten there yet. His name is Thomas Kuzma. I met him when I did a keynote in Sydney, Australia, and he's a wonderful person, so I can't wait to watch that. And you know, that aspect of intersectionality, which breaches into, and maybe I shouldn't get into because it will just transfer to all kinds of other intersectional, you know, conversations, which we should have, but which we don't have time for today. The LGBTQ issue is, I think, predominant in our world for a couple of reasons. Number one, which is one of the benefits of the autism spectrum, is you do not pick up on gender stereotypes as much as neurotypical people do. And so maybe you get shouted down for, you know, non-gender abiding behaviors a lot more when you're younger, but at the same point, I think it's a healthier way to grow up. And secondly, is that whenever you've come out about anything in life, whether it's being on the autism spectrum, whether it's being queer, that the second outing process that you end up having to do because you are intersectional is so much easier because you know that you learned from the first time you had to come out about something that you didn't die. And that's really, really beneficial. So I love the show. Misuse of accommodation. I've noticed an increased sense. Okay, got a question here, interesting. Misuse of accommodations. I have noticed an increased tendency in secondary education for parents to have their kids tested for neurological handicap in order to get extra time on exams, easier assignments, etc. How can we prevent fraud in diagnosis, especially if disability starts to get a privileged treatment both in education and the work environment? Here's how I would answer this question. I'm not going to tell you that that fraud doesn't exist. But I will tell you, however, that the legitimate and ignored cases of a need and a right to those accommodations outweighs the fraud cases by 100 to 1 easily. There just aren't that many horrible people that are committing fraud in this capacity. And I think that we have to examine the mindset that sometimes we have in thinking that we're distrusting people so inherently. It's just, I mean, if I was neurotypical and didn't need accommodations, but maybe would have a free pass on something if I sought it out, I'd kind of be wondering, like, is that really worth it? Is that really worth it to my reputation if people found out about that? And I just don't think it is. Okay, let's see, we're gonna do one more quick question. Well, it's a quick one, so I'll do this one. Can a child who never presented autistic behaviors develop them during adolescence? Yes. A lot of times, you know, whether we show, you know, the autism that's inherent in us, we have to remember that this is genetic. But of course, there can be environmental exacerbators. If somebody discovers that, you know, they have headaches around fluorescent lights, well, you're not going to watch the discomfort until that person gets in front of fluorescent lights. So, you know, if they never have to deal with the sensory issue, involving their hearing because they live out in the country and the first time they take a visit to the city and they're going like this all the time, then suddenly you see that person's autism. We have to remember too, when we talked about passion and humor, that there's a medical ethic that we must remember, that we cannot say that doesn't exist only because we can't see it. If passion only looks like Luciano Pavarotti singing an opera aria or the way David Ortiz looks at a hanging slider, we're gonna miss a lot. And with that, I think it is time to turn it over to Lisa. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate this.
Thank you, Michael John Carley. We so appreciate this, the history. Thank you for taking such good care with the questions. I know we couldn't get to all of the questions. We have close to 200 people here. So we do keep your questions online though. Feel free to reach out to our office through our Global Inclusion email, or of course you can email Michael John directly. I just wanna again say thank you to all of our partners. Thank you to the Provost, Katie Fleming. Thank you to everyone who's teaching classes, everyone who's doing the great work out there, and to all the committees and partners that I thanked earlier in this program. Again, we appreciate the partnership. Please join us for all of the programs that we will be doing. Again, these issues around disability, access, design, we remain committed to our action steps. And so thank you very much again, Michael John. Thank you for being part of the team. And we look forward to the ongoing work. Take good care, everyone out there. And we will see you again soon. Bye now.